Okay, so what I would like to tell you today, this morning, in the next 30 minutes or so, is really somewhat an overview about mantle cell lymphoma. Where are we standing? Where are we going to? What are our ideas? What I can tell you right away, we're just on the move to overcome this disease. And while I show you my disclosures, I can tell you this is really a misconception that we have just the very powerful German study group. That's not the case, because in fact what we have a couple of smaller study groups, and they're specialized disease-wise. So we have one for aggressive lymphoma, we have one for indolent lymphoma, we have one for CLL, one for Hodgkin, and everyone is contributing to each one. So this is how our networking works. And in fact, I very much appreciated that mantle cell lymphoma is now a subject for the within the scope of indolent lymphoma, because for us in Europe, specifically in Germany, that were the roots of mantle cell lymphoma. And the initial descriptions in the 70s, in fact, by Karl Leonard, that has been classified as indolent lymphoma. And of course, you know, in the WHO, it was aggressive lymphoma from the beginning on. And as always, the truth is somewhere in between. And we come back to that point. So what I would like to touch is really, let me say whether. I will start with a little bit these clinical heterogeneity and really to pinpoint how we can individualize our treatment, move on to the standards of younger patients and elderly patients, and finish up, which I think will be really the major breakthrough for the next 5 years or so. So this is the first problem about mantle cell lymphoma. In fact, I would argue probably this is the problem we have already solved, which is the problem of diagnosis. Because in previous times, I told you we have already experienced since the 70s with this kind of disease, we double-checked how reliable our pathology is. And we do have in Germany a network of reference pathologies, so all of our study patients are undergoing, well, not the patients, the pathology specimens are undergoing review. And what we could identify in the good old days, that in fact the diagnosis of mantle cell lymphoma was accurate in only 1/3 of the cases. And why is that? Well, of course you have this typical cytology with the cleaved nuclei as shown here, but you really have a wide variation. And therefore it was really a breakthrough to identify the characteristic 11-14 translocation, and really the specific overexpression of cyclin D1 is really an absolute major step forward. Within our current trials, in fact, we have a 98% accuracy of the diagnostics of mantle cell lymphoma. So this is really a breakthrough you might not consider if you have not had the previous experience. Now, what does cyclin D1 do? It's one of the checkpoints of cell proliferation. It's involved in the phosphorylation of the RB, tumor suppressor gene, and therefore it's of no surprise that specifically cell proliferation is the most prominent risk factor in mantle cell lymphoma, and we'll come back to that, because this is also a point we do apply clinical-wise. The most reliable method to detect that is in fact by gene array analysis. However, at least in our countries, probably as well as in Canada, we are not able to apply that on a daily routine. And therefore, we are somewhat stuck. But what I can tell you that, in fact, within the initial panel of genes, at least the expanded panel of 35 genes, Ki67 was included. And if you apply this Ki67 detection not only on RNA level, but on protein level, which is all about immunohistochemistry, yes, it works most favorable. And although there is really some major problem when it comes to standardization, it's fair to say that if you just set up these cutoffs as shown here, you will be able to identify 3 different risk groups. The low risk group with Ki67 below 10%, the somewhat intermediate or typical mantle cell lymphoma do have a cell proliferation in the range of 20 to 30%, and then the, quote, high risk group above 40%. In fact, this predictor is stronger than histology, because you have, well, you know that, of course, high proliferation is correlated to blastoid subtypes, but on the other hand, you have some classical mantle cell lymphoma with high proliferation, and they behave more unfavorable. Okay, this is somewhat summarizing what we know about mantle cell lymphoma, and I think it really illustrates that we're talking about spectrum of disease. And the point is, all of these cases do have the characteristic 11-14 translocation. Sorry, I'm pointing to this side because I was sitting all the conference there and everyone was doing like that. So I thought it would be fair now to, go to this side. This is no political statement, so I have to say though. All right, well, anyway, so all of these mantle cell lymphoma from the beginning on have the 11-14 translocation. But what is fair to say, we have somewhat these indolent type of mantle cell lymphoma, and it's very important, these cases, they almost exclusively have the 11-14. They have very little additional alterations. On the other hand, these represent only 10 to 15% of cases. I know our New York colleagues claim it's up to 30%. Probably, again, we have to compromise at 15 to 20%, but definitely not more. And then, in fact, happens what, based on ATM alterations, other alterations, that you have instability of the genome. And quite a number of secondary alterations do occur, and that's probably the reason why mantle cell lymphoma has such a poor outcome. And in fact, it's the disease with the most frequent secondary alterations. And this probably explains the typical classical mantle cell lymphoma with initial high responses but quick relapses. And then finally, we have what I would quote is somewhat similar to secondary transformation in follicular lymphoma. In fact, we could also prove in some cases this switch from classic to blastoid mantle cell lymphoma. And at least in our series, this is a rare event. It's just in the range of 5%. And P53 and P16 alterations seem to play a crucial role in this final step of malignant pathogenesis. Now, what do we apply clinical-wise? And again, unfortunately, we just set here with some simple prognostic markers. And this is somewhat a simplified IPI, the MIPI, and that has been, meanwhile, confirmed by quite a number of other groups. This is the confirmation in our own data set of almost 900 patients. And it really splits 3 different risk groups. And it has only 4 parameters, which is performance status, age, LDH as unspecific tumor marker, and leukocyte count. And by that, you can really split up these 3 different risk groups, and that also holds up for overall survival. Now, let's bring that in real life. I heard you're heading back to election pretty soon, so now this is your chance to practice. This is a case from our clinic, 55-year-old male, no B symptoms, leukocytes, let's say, in the upper part of the normal range, LDH, again, just our cutoff is 240, so just below the cutoff, and typical stage 4 with abdominal nodes, but as well colon and bone marrow involvement. So the question to you is now, what is the risk score of these patients? And I did not provide these questions ahead of time, so you're not going to press your button on the TED system, but doing it the old way, to raise your right hand. And so 3 options: high, low, and intermediate risk. So who would say this is a low risk group? None. Who is thinking this is an intermediate risk patient? Okay, I would probably say 1/3 of you. And who would say this is a high risk patient? None. So 2/3 of you have acute palsy in their right hand. But anyway, this is a typical low-risk patient. And that's important to say. If you just check the literature and all the studies on dose intensification, the majority of these patients are a low risk. And that at least explains part of their favorable results. However, if we're talking low risk, what is our current standard of treatment in these patients? And this is somewhat counterintuitive, because in these mostly low-risk patients, we're going for dose intensification. It may be either hyper-CVAD. We in Europe prefer the autologous transplantation, so sequential dose intensification. Why is that? Well, we do have a randomized trial, one of the very few in this field, And based on analysis of this trial, what we could show, first of all, that autologous transplantation does improve progression-free survival independent of rituximab, and that's shown here with significance for both of the factors. And the best outcome, of course, is for the patients who did receive both autologous transplantation and prior rituximab. Now, this also translates in improvement of overall survival. And this improvement is significantly only so far for the autologous transplantation as shown here. And with the bluish curve, in fact, the best outcome, the patients who did, again, receive both. So yes, overall survival is being improved by autologous transplantation. And I'm not going to show you the data, but this is specifically also the case for the low-risk patients. So despite the fact these are low-risk patients, they have long ongoing benefit by the dose intensification. Now, these are the results of our colleagues from MD Anderson, and they applied a different approach, let's say an upfront dose intensification, and although their initial results were brilliant, what you can see, in fact, that they have some ongoing remission, some ongoing relapse pattern. So even with this approach, we're not able to cure these patients. It's fair to say the relapses occur later, so we definitely, our patients do benefit, but they still do occur. And then you've seen, of course, these data, and that just, I put it in this order to tell you, although our Scandinavian colleague Christian Geisler claimed in the initial publication that this is a plateau and that the majority of these patients will be cured. In fact, this is what also MD Anderson claimed 10 years ago. It's not the case. With further follow-up, late relapses do occur. What they have observed, in fact, still is a significant improvement. And the explanation for that is somewhat a mixed bag. I will show you data that we, in fact, based on historical comparison, we significantly have improved outcome. They did add rituximab, they did add RRC, and they did treat what they quoted molecular responses, and that was not counted as an event in these curves. So you have to be a little bit cautious, but anyway, that was the rationale for us to start with this randomized trial. And there we specifically asked the question, what is the benefit of adding up high-dose RRC in induction as well as consolidation? And to make a long story short, these study arms were, of course, balanced based on the large number of patients, almost 500 patients. But I really would like to make the point also in this study, if you have a look at the, and I have to, sorry for the wrong colors, around 85% of these patients, in fact, were low or intermediate risk patients. Only around 15% were high-risk patients, just in line with what I told you previously. What about toxicity? Here we are with the non-hematological toxicity and really make the point, yes, toxicity was higher in the experimental arm. But what you can also see is that most of these bars have faint colors indicating grade 1, grade 2 toxicity, and grade 3, grade 4 toxicity was rather modest. Therefore, yes, it's feasible also in the multi-center approach. And this is the primary study aim. We had a plus of 10 to 15% in time to treatment failure. And at least in Europe, these data led to the concept that this is our new standard treatment approach. Somewhat compromising between hyper-CVAD and CHOP followed by autologous transplantation. We now add up RRC into induction and consolidation. Now, if you have a close look at that data, it's very interesting that the CR/PR rates after autologous transplantation seems to be almost comparable. However, if you have a look at the longer outcome, PR after CHOP autologous transplantation is not very worthwhile. Whereas the patients with the RDHAP who achieved only PR still did rather reasonable. Overall survival is not yet improved. There's a difference of around 5%, and so far the follow-up is just far too short. We're just in the range of 3 years, so that will take another 3 years at least to have some meaningful numbers. But what we did in the study, in addition to get a better feeling about the quality of remission, we performed systematically minimal residual disease detection by PCR. And that is somewhat a laborious method, but gives you a very exact measurement, quantification of the involvement of peripheral blood and bone marrow. And based on these results, what you could see, in fact, is that the rate of MRD negativity in this series was much higher in the DHEP arm. And interestingly, it was also much higher than the CR rates, just to make that point. Now the question is, what is more meaningful? But let's first of all have a glimpse at the subsequent comparison. What did the autologous transplantation add? And I think this figure nicely shows you these data. Definitely, most specifically the CHOP patients definitely benefit by autologous transplantation. So CHOP only is insufficient in mantle cell lymphoma. However, on the other hand, also the DAP patients did improve their MRD rate by more than 10%. So yes, in both arms, autologous transplantation did add, and I'm not going to show you the data, but just telling you that the patients who underwent DAP induction but not went on to autologous transplantation had a much poorer outcome. And of course, what we also could show is that MRD, in fact, is an extremely powerful prognostic marker or predictor of outcome. And here these patients with negative MRD status after induction, in fact, it might well be that some of these patients will never have to be treated again for their mantle cell lymphoma. And this factor was more powerful than just differentiation between CR and PR, as shown in this graph. And these data had been somewhat similarly published in a much smaller patient cohort last year. Okay, so how do we move on? Well, our belief is not that further dose intensification will really improve the outcome of our patients. Now, we really would like to add a more intelligent treatment, and if you have listened to Jill Sell yesterday, you might have heard that, for example, maintenance works best in patients where you have achieved a high quality remission. And just following that line, it should be especially beneficial after autologous transplantation, and that is what we're just exploring in a French-German trial which is underway and has recruited 150 patients so far. Okay, let's move on to the more typical patient. And this is again a case report just similar to the one I showed you previously. Slightly older, now it's 65, again no BA symptoms, leukocytes slightly elevated, LDH a little bit elevated, not much, and stage 4 just the same as the previous. And now I'm watching every one of you very strictly, so don't dare not to show your hands. So who is saying, well, the last patient was low risk, okay? So who is in favor of being this patient a low risk? None. Who is thinking that this patient is an intermediate risk? Good. Hey, I have seen that. And who is thinking this is a high-risk patient? No one. Again, another acute palsy. Well, anyway, what I really would like to tell you is this is a typical high-risk patient based on MIPI. And it's really the point, the people we are talking about, typical patients with mantle cell lymphoma, you would probably argue these are the first patients where you would consider not to treat aggressively. These are the high-risk patients. So you have to consider that if you're discussing some watch-and-wait approaches in these patients. What have we done for these patients? And this is the curve I promised you. We just check for our results in the 70s and the 90s. We have already observed that we in fact could double overall survival. And that was not yet implementing high dose, that was not yet implementing rituximab. So really making the point, if you go into phase 2 studies with historical comparisons, be cautious. Now, what is the reason for that? One of this reason, in fact, is the addition of rituximab to chemotherapy. And it's fair to say that in mantle cell lymphoma, there are quite some disputable results on the benefit of rituximab, but there's somewhat a conclusion. Response rates do increase, and the duration of response, as shown here, is somewhat doubled, but still these patients tend to relapse. So rituximab is not the final answer to mantle cell lymphoma, but it's definitely, let's say, one piece of the mosaic. And then again, This slide I showed already 2 days ago. We in Germany have quite some experience with bendamustine. And as you might recognize based on the trendy fashion of these gentlemen, it has been quite some time since we have really explored the benefits of bendamustine and the disadvantages. In fact, in the beginning, the medical community was really split in Germany. And why is that? Well, bendamustine was very efficient, but it was very toxic, specifically cumulative myelotoxicity. And then it's really the benefit of Matthias Rummel that he cut down the initial standard dose down to 60%. So in our initial experiments were, in fact, our studies were based on 150 milligrams per square meter twice. And he cut it down to 90 milligrams and performed a randomized study with the current standard of CHOP. And what's fair to say that the side effects are much more beneficial. In my opinion, this is really the major advantage of bendamustine. And therefore, specifically if we're talking elderly patients, this is of major advantage. And in the small subgroup of subgroup analysis of mantle cell lymphoma, response rate was a little bit lower, but what is more important when it comes to progression-free survival, duration of remission seems to be longer. I'm not absolutely sure about this data, but it's very suggesting. Still, what you can see is you do achieve long-term remissions in some of these patients, and these are probably the quote indolent mantle cell lymphoma, but the majority of patients will still relapse even after bendamustine. So we do need something in addition, and that is what we're exploring. Some post-induction, I think that is really critical in mantle cell lymphoma to extend duration of remission. And we have performed this study with almost 600 patients, our MCL elderly trial, where we compared different induction schemes, fludarabine versus CHOP, and also different consolidations, interferon versus rituximab. Interferon does have some impact in mantle cell. And this is the patient cohort, and I really would like to make that point. Here, out of sudden, we're talking about more than 90% intermediate and high risk. So a totally different patient population than our MCL younger trial. And that's very important. Results, I'm sorry, will be presented pretty soon in 2 months, but I can tell you this study will really establish a new standard of care in mantle cell lymphoma because one of the study arms more than doubled duration of remission. And you might guess which one. Okay, so what about molecular approaches? I think this is really what we've learned during the couple of last years, that the molecular pathogenesis of mantle cell lymphoma is now quite well being understood. And what is even more important, that this is now also clinically applied in that way that we can overcome or interact with some of the crossings of this molecular pathogenesis. And I really would like to pinpoint for this mTOR inhibitor, which is in fact registered in Europe, and bortezomib, which is registered in North America. Now, if you consider all these data on these different molecular approaches, and that is a historic paper, I think it's already 2 years old, but really giving an overview about different antibody-based and other molecular approaches, and all of them in a line-hour range, response rates 30%, 1/3, and duration of remission or median progression-free survival in the range of 6 to 9 months, which is good, but which is no home run, and therefore we have to improve that. Same data hold up for bortezomib in the pivotal registration trial. However, based on some in vitro synergism in the lab, we and other groups, meanwhile, have joined to explore combinations of chemotherapy and bortezomib, and I think this is really an extremely powerful approach. We had performed a pilot study really achieving some long-term outcome in some of these patients. A lady in our institution, in fact, she had relapses all through her previous course of disease within 1 year. And then she received this combination of high-dose ROC and bortezomib, and now that was in fact her 4th or 5th line. And now she's in ongoing CR for 4 years. So there's something in this combination, and we're currently investigating that in a randomized trial. Lenalidomide, I think, is, for me, extremely astonishing. That's a drug which works in all kinds of different diseases, up to MDS, myeloid, whatever. and we're not quite sure how it works, but it works. If we just take over the data from multiple myeloma and say, well, what about the combination of Len-Dex? Well, it's probably not such a good idea in mantle cell lymphoma, because that has been explored by our Italian colleagues, and what they found out, in fact, by the combination, that toxicity went up significantly, specifically the infectious complications, and the conclusion of our Italian colleagues was, in fact, not to proceed with this combination. And then here we are with mTOR. I already mentioned that temsirolimus is being registered in Germany for mantle cell lymphoma, and it's quite an interesting pathway which I think will gain more and more importance during the next years, because we now know how important the B-cell receptor triggered signal pathway is. And here again, we had some experience by our don't laugh, or, well, I have to go back, okay, otherwise you don't listen to me. We had some experience by our Swiss colleagues. In fact, they performed, I would call it monotherapy, well, almost maintenance trial, because what they've seen with RAD-001, response rate is rather low, but you do have a higher range of stable disease. And therefore, as lenalidomide, RAD-001 probably seems to be especially prone for some maintenance procedures. And then, here we are, you know these guys, and I'm happy as long as the auditorium might tell me who is bird of these two guys, I feel young. Because what we did, this is just an ongoing study that, again, based on some in vitro synergism, we investigate the combination of bendamustine plus temsirolimus, and so far the results are quite encouraging. We have completed the first dose level, which was temsirolimus 25 milligrams. We're now at 50 milligrams, and response rates are quite satisfying. Okay, I already mentioned the mTOR signal pathway and mentioned the connection to the B-cell receptor. And I think it's a no-brainer that malignant lymphoma, at least 90% of malignant lymphoma, derive from the B cells. And B cells are closely regulated by the B-cell receptor. So it was essentially obvious, or should have been obvious, that if you are able to overcome the signal pathway of the B-cell receptor, you might also target lymphoma. And yes, this is absolutely the case, and that is one of the new phase studies, the early phase studies. This had been performed with a PI3K inhibitor, which is just, you know, upstream of mTOR and AKT, and just by simple pill a day with a rather favorable side effects, you will see that in mantle cell lymphoma you gain responses in quite a number of these patients. Well, these are just the first results according response rates, and we do not know so far about the duration of response, which tend to be always short in mantle cell lymphoma. But again, now combination studies are underway to explore this compound in combination with a chemotherapy backbone. So having said that, and this is somewhat my conclusion, these are the current what have we learned during the last, let's say, 2-3 years. I would argue that high-dose ROC is now part of the package for our younger patients. And I also put up some comment on the post-induction based on the elderly trial. But what is most important, our next steps will be really these molecular approaches, and preferable, in fact, in combination. We do have some intelligent combinations of biologicals. However, when it comes to clinical application, they were not really able to overcome the disease. So I would say for the time being, the chemotherapy backbone remains part of the standard treatment of mantle cell lymphoma. And again, some of you might have seen this very elegant post on allotransplant in mantle cell lymphoma. In my opinion, allotransplant still remains reserved for relapsed disease or the patients not appropriately responding to first-line treatment. And with that, I would like to finish, just give you an overview of our current trials, and what you can see is a couple of these studies I was already referring to, the rituximab maintenance after autologous transplantation. At the same time, our consortium is performing a large phase 3 trial investigating the lenalidomide maintenance, similar as in multiple myeloma. In younger patients, in fact, in elderly patients, we want to explore R maintenance plus minus lenalidomide. This study is already ongoing, high-dose RC plus minus bortezomib, and different molecular approaches.